Hello everyone, bringing you a video today looking at the recreation of an Australian infantryman of 3 RAR, that is the 3rd Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment, on arrival in Korea in September of 1950. Now I had originally planned to make this video as part of the series looking at British and Commonwealth troops in Korea, serving in Korea, which I started of course looking at 27 Brigade, men of 27 Brigade, specifically the Middlesex Regiment. We also had a look at New Zealand troops heading off for Korea, part of K-Force. Unfortunately, some of the bits and pieces to look at this recreation, to put this recreation together, hadn't arrived at that time, so this is somewhat delayed, but nevertheless, hopefully it will be of interest. 3 RAR was Australia's primary land forces contribution to the Korean War. Of course, the Royal Australian Air Force had already been involved in the skies of Korea prior to the arrival of 3rd Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment. But the battalion would go on to form the 3rd Battalion of the 27th Commonwealth Brigade. Obviously we've talked in previous videos about 27th Infantry Brigade arriving from Hong Kong, very much a scratch brigade with 2 infantry battalions and very little else in terms of support, and the arrival of 3 RAR was very welcome in bolstering that brigade, with the supporting arms and so forth essentially being provided by the US, initially at least. So, as I say, 27 Brigade had arrived in Korea prior to this. 3 RAR went out to Korea to join 27 Brigade as the 3rd Infantry Battalion of that brigade, and what we're going to have a look at in this video is the kit and equipment of a newly arrived infantryman of 3 RAR.
Looking at an overview of the recreation here, you can see that most of the kit and equipment is that used during the Second World War, which was very common for most troops deployed to Korea in 1950. The service dress uniform, details aside, is quite similar to that issued as long ago as the First World War, whilst the web equipment is the 1937 pattern. We'll get into the details of that shortly. The first thing to look at is the weapon carried, and this is the Rifle No. 1 Mark III Star, again dating back to the Great War and beyond. Australia maintained this as its standard rifle through into the 1950s, and was eventually replaced by the self-loading rifle. The No. 4 was never adopted in any numbers. Talking more about the uniform, we'll start at the top as we normally do, and the essentially standard Australian headdress is worn, the slouch hat, and you can see this is worn without a puggaree. Photographs of the time show a mix of hats with and without puggarees, and I removed the one from mine in this instance. As already mentioned, the basic uniform consists of service dress with a drab wool jacket and trousers. The jacket is of a pattern introduced during the course of the Second World War, but is nevertheless quite similar to that worn during the Great War, which gives Australian soldiers quite a distinct look through the first half of the 20th century. The trousers are just plain drab wool trousers, and underneath the jacket a khaki drill shirt is worn. This could be augmented with a cardigan for colder weather, but during the winter of 1950-51, Australian soldiers would do as the rest of 27 Brigade did and acquire US cold weather clothing to augment their own uniforms. The men of 3 RAR were better prepared than the men of the British battalions in the 27th Commonwealth Brigade in that they did have a wool uniform, whereas the 2 British battalions embarked from Hong Kong arrived in Korea with only their jungle green cotton uniform, so not suitable at all for the harsh Korean winter. A detail of the insignia here, you can see that Royal Australian Regiment shoulder titles are worn, a relatively new piece of insignia for the Australian Army, the regiment having only recently been formed. This leading on from a decision taken to establish a permanent standing army for Australia in comparison to the militia system with a cadre of regulars which had existed previously. It was decided in the immediate post-war era that Australia needed a permanent regular military force, and 3 battalions of the Royal Australian Regiment were formed as a result of this. One piece of insignia which is conspicuous by its absence is the Rising Sun collar badge. Photographs of 3 RAR arriving in Korea in 1950 show a real mix of these being worn and not being worn. So there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to that. Some men have them, some don't. So I've omitted them in this instance. They aren't worn. As already mentioned, the web equipment is of 1937 pattern, primarily of Canadian manufacture with one major exception. The basic pouches are of a modified Australian design. They are enlarged. They're sometimes referred to as 1943 pattern. There were several different components of 1937 pattern which were modified for Australian service, and these are one example of that. They are wider, considerably wider than the normal basic pouches, giving a greater carrying capacity. And photos of 3 RAR show a mix of these with the standard 1937 pattern basic pouches. The use of Canadian-made 1937 pattern is very common. Large stocks of Canadian manufactured 1937 pattern were provided to Australia during the course of the Second World War, and Canadian made components of 1937 pattern show up as late as the Vietnam War in the 1960s. One distinct feature of this Canadian made equipment is the later production L straps, which you can see here. There's no reduction from 2 to 1 inch strap above the hooks. The 2 inch strap runs all the way down to them, and this is just a visually distinct element of late production Canadian 1937 pattern. Round on the right hip you can see the water bottle is carried, and this is carried in a Canadian made water bottle carrier with the press stud or snap on the front of the carrier rather than up on the shoulder of the bottle. A caveat here, the enamel bottle in its felt cover is of British manufacture, of course. Australian made bottles would have been far more common at the time. Unfortunately, that's something I have yet to acquire. Round on the left hip, the bayonet for the rifle is carried in a standard 1937 pattern frog, but this is almost entirely concealed by the haversack. The web equipment, of course, being set up in marching order. The haversack is carried on the brace ends on the hip. This would carry things like the cardigan, cap comforter, hold all and so forth, the mess tins, carried down on the hip because the pack is being carried on the back. And we can see that here. The pack is carrying an unusually heavy load. There's no room inside for the ground sheet or indeed the blanket, which is being carried wrapped inside the ground sheet. And this has been folded into a horseshoe shape and then tied onto the outside of the pack, and elements such as the greatcoat and so forth will be carried inside the pack. In addition, a Mark II steel helmet with helmet net has been strapped to the back of the pack using the supporting straps. And this is fairly typical when changing stations. Loads beyond that initially intended to be carried in marching order had to be carried. So as was seen in the video of a recreation of a man of the Middlesex Regiment in 27 Brigade arriving in Korea, where the blanket had been tied to the outside of the pack, in this case a blanket wrapped in the ground sheet has been tied to the outside of the pack. And this is a Mark VII ground sheet, the type introduced during the Great War, which has an extra section of cloth allowing it to be buttoned round the body and worn as a cape. And this is an original example of Australian manufacture. The final thing to look at here is the footwear, and this consists of a set of Australian 3-buckle gaiters or leggings. These are based on US practice, but close in quite a different way. There are no laces, there are instead 3 straps. One strap runs under the foot, similar to US practice. The other 2 secure the gaiter around the leg. There's one midway up the gaiter and then another just at the base of the calf. And that way the gaiters are tightened around the lower leg. These are something which will be looked at in more detail in a future video. And these are worn with the standard Australian ankle boots, now in black leather. A decision was taken in the years immediately post Second World War that a change would be made from brown leather footwear for other ranks to black leather as we have here. So it's basically just a change in the colour of the leather. The design of the boot is exactly the same as those introduced during the course of the Second World War. So that's a look at this recreation in some detail. Hopefully you found it interesting looking through this kit. As I say, quite distinctive Australian kit here, particularly the service dress, giving this Australian soldier quite a distinctive look right the way through from the First World War to this time period when battle dress began to replace it. As I say, the kit is based specifically on that of men arriving in Korea in 1950, hence the heavy load carried using 1937 pattern web equipment set up in marching order.
So there we are. I hope you found it interesting looking at this. As I say, the initial intention was to make this part of a series on the actual anniversary of the deployments to Korea in 1950, looking at those 70 years on, but unfortunately that wasn't possible with this particular example. But nevertheless, I hope it's been interesting looking at this in the video. If you have found it interesting and you'd like to see more from the channel, please do consider subscribing if you haven't already. And whether you're newly subscribing or you've previously subscribed, please do make sure you hit the little bell with the notification button down below, and that will of course alert you when I upload future videos. If you really like my uploads and you would like to support the channel, you can. Both Patreon and PayPal are linked down below, and a massive thank you as ever to everybody who supports the channel using those methods. Thank you very much indeed. If you'd like to follow the channel on social media, you can. Facebook, Instagram and Twitter are all linked down below, and there will of course be photographs of this posted up over there as well. And if you'd like to get in touch, but you're not really a social media user, there is of course an email address down below as well. That's everything for this video, so until next time, bye for now.